Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're from. The city pulsed with restless energy as the evening fell, the streets illuminated by the dull glow of street lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Rain had been threatening to fall all day, heavy clouds pressing down on the skyline, thick with unspoken promises of an impending downpour. When the first drop finally splashed onto the cracked concrete of the sidewalk, Jalen Carter barely noticed. He was too tired to care. He had spent the entire day working in the maintenance department of a high-rise office building in Midtown, crawling through ventilation shafts, replacing faulty wiring, and fixing a broken HVAC system in one of the executive floors. His muscles ached. His fingers were raw from handling tools all day, and his shirt clung to his back with the remnants of sweat and grime. All he wanted was to catch the bus home, take a quick shower, and collapse onto his bed. But life, as usual, had other plans. As he turned the corner, he spotted a woman standing near the bus stop, a slight frown creasing her otherwise poised features. She was dressed in an expensive-looking coat, the dark fabric tailored perfectly to her figure, her blonde hair sleek and immaculately styled despite the increasing humidity. Everything about her screamed wealth, privilege, a life far removed from his own. And yet, something about the way she anxiously rummaged through her purse told him that at this moment she wasn't in control. She let out a quiet sigh of frustration, her fingers digging through the contents of her designer bag, extracting a lipstick, a key ring, a neatly folded business card, everything but what she was searching for. Her breath came shallowly, her shoulders rising with barely contained impatience as she checked the pockets of her coat. Then she stopped, pressing her lips together as if to compose herself. Jalen knew the look. He'd seen it before on people unaccustomed to problems like this, people who had never experienced the minor inconveniences of daily life that people like him faced regularly. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and considered just ignoring it. Not his business. He didn't owe this woman anything. But something in the way she squared her shoulders as if she was preparing for battle made him pause. Jalen shifted his stance and cleared his throat, his voice coming out even and calm. "Need some help?" The woman turned her head sharply, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her. Her gaze landed on him, first on his face, then slowly taking in his worn-out hoodie, his jeans slightly smudged with oil from an earlier repair job. Her blue eyes lingered for a beat longer than necessary, and he braced himself for whatever judgment was about to follow. She hesitated, then exhaled through her nose. "I lost my wallet," she admitted, her voice smooth, well-trained for business meetings and negotiations. "And my phone is dead." Jalen nodded, unsurprised. "Rough day." "You have no idea." She glanced at the approaching bus and back at her empty hands, her jaw tightening. Jalen considered his options. He had exactly $44.75 on him, just enough to cover his own fare home and maybe grab a quick meal if he stretched it right. But something about the way she stood there, tense and unwilling to ask for help, made the decision easy. Without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills and some loose change, and held them out to her. "Here," he said simply. "Bus fare." The woman blinked as if he had just spoken a foreign language. She looked down at the money in his outstretched hand, then back at him, her expression unreadable. People like her didn't expect things like this from people like him. "I can pay you back," she said slowly, still not taking the money. Jalen shrugged. "Don't worry about it, just pay it forward sometime." Something flickered in her gaze. Curiosity, maybe even a sliver of discomfort. It was clear she wasn't used to being in this position, but after a moment's hesitation, she reached out and took the cash. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time since he'd seen her, her voice carried something genuine. Jalen simply nodded. The bus pulled up with a loud hiss of brakes, and she stepped toward it, glancing at him one last time before disappearing behind the sliding doors. As the bus rumbled away, Jalen shoved his hands back into his pockets and exhaled, already pushing the encounter to the back of his mind. He had done what felt right. That was all. He didn't know that the woman he had just helped was Claire Monroe, CEO of the very company that owned the building where he worked. He didn't know that by the next morning, his world would start shifting in ways he could never have expected. And he definitely didn't know that, for the first time in years, Claire Monroe would find herself unable to stop thinking about a stranger. The next morning, the city hummed with its usual rhythm, a steady pulse of movement and noise that never truly ceased. Claire Monroe stepped out of her car and into the sleek, glass-walled building that bore her name. The world of corporate power welcomed her back with the precision of a machine, doors opening at her presence, assistants falling into step beside her, emails piling up in the inbox she would soon clear with sharp efficiency. But for the first time in years, her mind was not wholly occupied by the carefully orchestrated routine of her day. She had slept poorly, which was unusual for her. Normally, she compartmentalized. Business was business. Life was structured, controlled. But as she sat in her office sipping the espresso that her assistant had placed on her desk at exactly 8:05 a.m., she found herself staring out the window, recalling the events of the previous night. The rain, the missing wallet, the stranger at the bus stop. He had given her money. Just like that. No hesitation, no expectation. It had unsettled her more than she cared to admit, not because she doubted the sincerity of his gesture, but because it forced her to confront something uncomfortable. How deeply insulated she was from the kind of world where losing a wallet could be anything more than a temporary inconvenience. Claire was used to negotiations, to calculated exchanges where every action had an expected return. But he hadn't asked for anything. He had simply helped. She hadn't even asked his name. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss Monroe?" Her assistant, Natalie, stepped inside holding a tablet. "The maintenance team is doing routine inspections today. There was an issue with the HVAC system on the 10th floor last night. Apparently, it's been resolved. Also, the service reports for the month are ready for your approval. Maintenance." Claire straightened slightly. "Which team handled the issue?" Natalie scrolled through her notes. "The night shift, mostly electrical work. I can get you specifics if needed." "Do that," Claire said, almost absently. A few minutes later, Natalie returned with a printed report highlighting the names of the staff who had worked late the previous night. Claire scanned the list, her gaze stopping abruptly. Jalen Carter. For a moment, she thought she had misread it. But no, there it was, the name of the man who had stood at that bus stop, offering her his last few dollars without a second thought. Her stomach twisted, though she wasn't sure why. She glanced at Natalie. "Where is Carter stationed today?" "Service department, ground floor. Most of the team is handling routine building inspections." Claire exhaled, pressing the papers lightly against her desk. It was an odd feeling, knowing she had been helped by someone who, technically, worked under her authority. She wondered what he would do if he saw her again. If he would acknowledge their brief encounter or pretend it hadn't happened. She decided she would find out. Leaving her office, she made her way toward the lower levels of the building, the parts that executives rarely visited. The service department was a stark contrast to the polished boardrooms and offices above. Concrete floors, metal lockers, tool racks lining the walls. The scent of industrial cleaner mixed with oil and dust. She spotted him almost immediately. Jalen was crouched beside an open electrical panel, checking connections with practiced ease. His uniform, a standard maintenance jumpsuit, was rolled at the sleeves, revealing strong forearms streaked with faded marks from years of manual labor. His hair was neatly trimmed, and there was an air of quiet focus about him, the kind that came with knowing your work inside and out. He hadn't seen her yet. Claire hesitated, feeling an unfamiliar nervous energy creep into her chest. It was ridiculous. She was the CEO of this company. She had led multi-million-dollar deals without blinking. Yet, for some reason, approaching this man now felt strangely uncertain. Finally, she cleared her throat. Jalen looked up. Recognition flickered across his face, but it was brief. No shock, no awkwardness, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, as if he were processing her presence and immediately deciding on his course of action. "Miss Monroe," he said after a beat, standing up. His voice was professional, unreadable. No sign of last night. No acknowledgement of the bus stop, the money, the rain. Just another day. Another superior addressing someone from the service team. Claire felt an odd sense of disappointment at his composure. "I wanted to personally thank you," she said, keeping her tone even, "for last night." Jalen's expression didn't change. It wasn't a big deal. It was to me. A pause. His eyes, dark and steady, held hers for a fraction longer than necessary before he gave a small nod. "Glad I could help." Something about his restraint intrigued her. Most people in his position, most people in general, would have reacted differently. Some with embarrassment, some with pride, some with that particular kind of defensiveness that came from feeling like charity had been given. But Jalen was none of those things. He was neutral, distant. Claire wasn't sure why that unsettled her. She shifted slightly. "Is there any way I can return the favor?" At that, Jalen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No need," he said simply. Not "no, thank you," or "I appreciate the offer," just a flat, definite rejection. It was the first time in a long time that someone had declined something from her without hesitation. Claire wasn't used to that. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Understood. Well, have a good rest of your shift, Carter." "You too, Miss Monroe." As she turned and walked away, she could feel his gaze on her back for a few seconds before he returned to his work. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it certainly hadn't been that. And she definitely hadn't expected that. As she rode the elevator back up to her office, her thoughts would still be lingering on him. Claire Monroe was not the kind of woman who let things linger in her mind. She prided herself on efficiency, on decisiveness, on the ability to keep her thoughts compartmentalized. Yet, as the days passed, she found her attention drifting toward the memory of Jalen Carter more often than she was willing to admit. It wasn't attraction, not in the way people might assume. It was curiosity. A fascination with his restraint, his composure, the way he had refused her gratitude as if it was entirely unnecessary. She wasn't used to people like him. In her world, everyone wanted something. But Jalen, he had walked away. The more she thought about it, the more it unsettled her. And perhaps that was why she found herself looking for him in the small, unnoticed corners of the building where people like her rarely ventured, not overtly. She wasn't so foolish as to make it obvious, but she started taking different routes to her office, pausing a second longer near the maintenance department, her gaze occasionally catching glimpses of him as he worked. He never looked her way. If he was aware of her presence, he gave no indication, and that, more than anything, made her feel something dangerously close to irritation. Claire was used to power. She was used to influence, to people acknowledging her presence the moment she stepped into a room. But Jalen, he treated her as though she were no different from any other executive in the building, just another name in a company too large for personal attachments. It was disorienting, even if she didn't want to admit why. At first, she told herself it was just the natural course of things. Their lives had intersected for a brief moment, but now they had returned to their respective worlds. But then, slowly, she started noticing something else. Jalen wasn't just avoiding her, he was withdrawing from everything. It was subtle. Small changes. Where he once spoke easily with his colleagues, she noticed he now kept his conversations short, nodding in acknowledgement but rarely engaging. His usual relaxed demeanor had been replaced with something harder, more measured. And most of all, there was the way he refused to meet her gaze whenever they happened to cross paths. Claire wasn't the only one who noticed. She overheard murmurs in the executive lounge, snippets of conversation among managers who had started speculating about the maintenance worker who had somehow caught the CEO's attention. Think she's grooming him for something? Maybe he's some kind of charity case. You know how these rich types love their social projects. I bet he thinks this is his big break. Won't be long before he asks for a promotion. The words sent a sharp wave of annoyance through her. These people had no idea who Jalen was. They assumed he was like them, calculating, ambitious in all the wrong ways. But Claire knew better. Jalen wasn't playing a game. He wasn't trying to climb the corporate ladder by association. If anything, he was running in the opposite direction. She wanted to confront them, to shut down their speculation, but she knew how these things worked. In the corporate world, perception was everything, and sometimes the truth didn't matter nearly as much as the stories people wanted to believe. That realization only made her frustration grow. She decided to handle it the way she handled most problems, directly. When she found Jalen in one of the maintenance corridors that evening, she barely hesitated before speaking. "Are you avoiding me, Carter?" Jalen didn't even flinch. If he was surprised by her sudden confrontation, he hid it well. He continued working, adjusting a pipe valve with careful precision before finally exhaling and turning toward her. His gaze was unreadable. "No, ma'am," he said, his tone neutral. "Just busy." "Liar," she said smoothly. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw a flicker of something cross his expression, an emotion too brief to name. "If you say so," he replied, then turned back to his work. Claire studied him for a long moment. "You do realize that the more you avoid me, the more people talk, right?" Jalen's grip tightened slightly on his wrench. "People were always going to talk," he said finally. Something about the way he said it made her pause. It wasn't resignation. It was experience. As if this wasn't the first time he had found himself caught in the crossfire of assumptions and whispered conversations. And suddenly, she understood. She had thought his distance was about her, but it wasn't. Not entirely. It was about survival. In her world, power was a tool, a currency, something to be leveraged and wielded with precision. But in his world, power was a risk. An invisible line drawn between those who were accepted and those who weren't. The moment people had seen her speaking to him, the moment they had begun speculating, they had decided that he didn't belong. And Jalen knew exactly how that story played out. She exhaled, suddenly feeling more tired than she had in weeks. "I can make it stop," she said quietly. "The rumors, the assumptions. If they think this is something it's not, I can—" "Doesn't matter," Jalen interrupted. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was firm, certain. "You can't change what people already decided to believe," he said. "And I don't need saving, Miss Monroe." Claire felt something tighten in her chest at his words. She should have let it go. She should have accepted his boundaries and moved on. But instead she found herself watching him, watching the quiet strength in his posture, the way he carried himself despite knowing the weight of the expectations placed on him. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say. So she didn't. She turned and walked away. But as she did, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Jalen had spent most of his life understanding one fundamental truth. There were some fights that weren't worth picking, some lines that weren't worth crossing, and above all, there were some people he wasn't supposed to get too close to. Claire Monroe had become one of those people. He had tried to ignore her presence in the building, had tried to act as though their worlds had never intersected at that bus stop. He had even convinced himself that if he simply kept his head down and did his job, people would lose interest. But the whispers hadn't stopped. The weight of unspoken accusations still pressed down on him like a storm cloud waiting to break. The thing about working in a place like this, in a city like this, was that perception was often more dangerous than reality. He didn't need to do anything wrong. He didn't need to say anything inappropriate. All it took was one assumption, one unfounded rumor, and he could lose everything. He wasn't willing to risk it. But what he hadn't expected was for Claire Monroe to push back. She wasn't the type to let things go. He had figured that out the moment she had confronted him in the maintenance corridor, questioning his distance as if it was something she had the right to understand. But what she didn't get, what she couldn't get, was that this wasn't about her. It was about survival. Still, she wasn't letting it go. Over the next few weeks, Claire's presence became impossible to ignore. She never sought him out directly again, but he could feel her eyes on him sometimes, watching from a distance. When she walked past the service department, her gaze lingered half a second too long. When he was in the building's common areas, he sometimes caught the flicker of recognition in her expression before she quickly looked away. And then, one evening, it all came to a head. Jalen had just finished a long shift, his body aching from crawling under elevator shafts to repair a malfunction in the wiring. He was tired, hungry, and all he wanted was to get out of this place before someone found a reason to keep him longer. That was when he heard them. His name. His story, warped and twisted into something unrecognizable, spoken by people who had no idea who he was. He paused near the break room, his grip tightening around the strap of his work bag as he listened. "I'm just saying, it's weird, isn't it? Monroe suddenly taking an interest in a guy from maintenance? Come on, man. You think she actually cares about him? She's playing a game. Either that, or she's got some kind of guilt complex. Rich people love doing this kind of thing. Find some working-class guy, act like they're going to change his life, then drop him when they get bored. Maybe she's sleeping with him. Laughter. Sharp, careless, like nails scraping against glass. Jalen's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew this was how it worked. Knew how quickly people could turn something innocent into something ugly. He had spent years staying quiet, staying in the background, because he understood that once a narrative took hold, there was no stopping it. And yet, for the first time in his life, The anger simmering in his chest felt like something he couldn't swallow down. He stepped into the room before he could stop himself. The laughter cut off instantly. 3 men, 2 of them mechanics he worked with, the other a manager from another department. They stiffened when they saw him, and for a second the room was thick with the tension of something unspoken. Jalen didn't say anything at first. He just looked at them. The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Hey, man, didn't see you there." "No," Jalen said flatly. "I bet you didn't." One of the mechanics, a wiry guy in his 40s who had always acted like he had something to prove, let out a forced chuckle. "Look, Carter, don't take it personal. We were just messing around." Jalen let the words hang between them. Messing around. As if their words hadn't carried weight. As if they hadn't just turned a simple act of kindness into something tainted. But what was worse was that deep down he knew this wasn't just about them. This was about every person in this building who had looked at him differently after Claire had acknowledged him. About the way people had suddenly started treating him as though he didn't belong here, as though he had crossed a line he wasn't supposed to cross. He knew how this ended. He had seen it happen before. A single rumor. A single misunderstanding. And a guy like him, he didn't get second chances. Jalen didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out of the break room, ignoring the murmured half-apologies that weren't really apologies at all. By the time he reached the service department, his decision was already made. He needed to cut himself off completely, from Claire, from this building, from the mess that he had never asked to be a part of. He would start looking for other jobs, even if it meant taking a pay cut. He had worked too damn hard to let someone else's assumptions ruin him. But, once again, Claire Monroe wasn't willing to let him disappear that easily. He had barely packed up his things for the night when she appeared in the doorway. She looked different. Not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but Jalen had spent enough time studying people to see it. There was something tight about the way she held herself, a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. She had heard. Of course she had. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You need to stop," Jalen said before she could even speak. Claire's expression didn't change. "Stop what?" "You know what?" A beat of silence stretched between them. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly do you think I've been doing, Carter?" Jalen exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He was too tired for this, too exhausted from years of navigating the minefield of being a black man in spaces like this where the rules were always different for people like him. "You don't get it," he muttered. "You never will." Her jaw tightened. "Then explain it to me." For a moment, he actually considered it. Considered telling her about all the little things she had never had to think about. About how men like him had to be twice as careful, twice as quiet, twice as perfect just to be seen as competent. About how, the second someone decided he was out of line, it wouldn't matter how good he was at his job. About how people like her, well-meaning, privileged, untouchable, could wade into a situation like this, disrupt everything, and then walk away without consequence. Instead, he just shook his head. "You and me," he said finally. "We don't belong in the same story." Claire's face remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that looked an awful lot like frustration, maybe even hurt, but she didn't argue. She just studied him for a long, long moment. And then she said, "Okay." Then she turned and walked away. Jalen told himself it was for the best, that this was the right choice, that this was the only way to stop things from spiraling even further out of control. But for the first time in years, as he stood there alone, he wasn't sure if he believed that anymore. Jalen told himself that things would get easier after he walked away. He had done what needed to be done, had cut the ties before they could tighten into something he couldn't escape. He had seen the consequences of staying too long in places that weren't meant for him, and he had no intention of letting himself be dragged into that same trap. And yet, the silence that followed in the days after his final conversation with Claire Monroe was heavier than he expected. He went to work, did his job, kept his head down. It should have been simple. This was what he had always done. Survive, navigate, endure. But there was a shift in the air now, something he couldn't quite name. People still talked, of course. That much hadn't changed. The whispers hadn't fully died down, though they had softened into something less direct, less cruel. Maybe because the distance between him and Claire had become visible to everyone. Maybe because he had made sure of it. But that didn't mean it was over. There were still looks from management, still an unspoken wariness in the way his supervisor assigned him tasks, as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake, as if they were still unsure whether he was someone to be tolerated or someone to be discarded. And then, one afternoon, he found proof that they had already made their decision. It started with a routine assignment, a broken air conditioning unit on the 17th floor. Jalen had handled things like this 100 times before, had run maintenance on this very system just last month. But when he pulled up the internal report on his tablet, he noticed something strange. There was a note attached to his work order. Performance under review. His stomach went tight. He had seen this before, knew exactly what it meant. Companies didn't fire people like him outright. No, they made it slow, gradual. They started with extra scrutiny, with nitpicking, with a sudden interest in performance where none had existed before. And then, once they had built a case, once they had enough to justify their decision on paper, they let him go. Jalen had spent his entire life knowing how easily the ground could shift beneath him. He wasn't going to wait for them to pull the rug out from under him this time. That night, he stayed up until 3 a.m, pulling up job postings, sending out applications, reaching out to old contacts who might have leads. He wasn't going to let himself be backed into a corner. By the end of the week, he had an offer. It wasn't glamorous. A small, independent maintenance company on the other side of town, nowhere near the level of infrastructure that Monroe Industries had. The pay was less, the benefits weren't as strong, but it was stable. It was his way out. And so, with a resignation letter typed and printed, he walked into work on Monday morning prepared to leave it all behind. But Claire Monroe wasn't done with him yet. He had barely stepped into the building when his supervisor stopped him, expression unreadable. "The CEO wants to see you," the man said. Jalen's grip tightened around the folder in his hand. Of course she did. He should have expected it. Should have known that walking away wouldn't be that simple. Claire Monroe wasn't the kind of person who let things go, but neither was he. So he made his way up to the executive floor, past the sleek glass walls and silent hallways that had always felt so distant from the world he knew. And then he stepped into her office. Claire was standing by the window when he entered, her back to him, gaze fixed on the city skyline. She turned when he closed the door, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something other than cold restraint in her eyes. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question, a fact. Jalen set the folder on her desk. Figured I'd save everyone the trouble. Her lips pressed together, her fingers curling slightly where they rested at her sides. "Is that what you think this is?" Jalen exhaled sharply. "I know what this is. I know how it goes. You don't have to pretend." Claire was silent for a long moment, and then, to his complete surprise, she let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You really think I'm letting you go because of a few rumors?" she asked. He met her gaze without flinching. "I think you don't have a choice. People like me don't get to be distractions in places like this. You know that just as well as I do." Something flickered in her expression, something sharp and unreadable. "You don't know what I know, Jalen." It was the first time she had ever used his first name. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it did. She stepped closer, resting a hand on the folder he had placed on her desk, but not opening it. "You've been under review because you challenged your supervisor over unsafe work conditions last month. That's why they put the note on your file. Not because of me." Jalen's jaw tightened. That complicated things. Because as much as he wanted to believe that it had all been about perception, about race, about the way people had looked at him ever since he had crossed some invisible boundary, he also knew that this company had never cared about worker safety. He had pushed back. He had fought to get better conditions for his team, and now he was paying the price. But that didn't change the fact that, in the eyes of management, Claire Monroe had only made things worse for him. "I still can't stay," he said. Claire studied him for a long moment. "Because of them?" "Because I have to build something for myself," he said, his voice quieter this time. "Something that doesn't rely on whether or not people like me. Something that can't be taken away because of the wrong conversation, the wrong assumption." She didn't argue, didn't tell him he was wrong. She just nodded once, as if she understood. Then she opened the folder, scanned the resignation letter, and placed it back down. "I won't accept it," she said simply. Jalen frowned. "That's not your call." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It is, actually." And then, before he could protest, she slid another folder across the desk. A job offer, his name at the top, a position in a new department. Better pay, more autonomy. His stomach twisted. "What is this?" Claire leaned forward, her gaze steady. "It's what you deserve. Not a handout, not a favor. A chance to do something real, something you built." Jalen hesitated, because this was the moment. This was the choice. And for the first time, he didn't know if walking away was still the right one. He looked at Claire Monroe, at the woman who had unknowingly turned his life upside down with a single act of kindness, and for the first time he let himself wonder. Maybe she wasn't just another problem to escape. Maybe she was something else entirely. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share it with others who might love it too. And if you want more stories like this, check out our other videos. There's always something waiting for you.